There are moments in life when we experience loss. Moments when things that once seemed secure are suddenly taken from us. It might be a relationship, a dream, an opportunity, or even a sense of peace that we had known. In these times, we often find ourselves in despair, wondering if things will ever return to what they once were. But what if I told you that what has been taken is not lost forever? But God, in His infinite grace, has a plan for restoration, and it may be unfolding in ways we cannot yet see. Restitution is a foundational part of God's nature. It is woven into the very essence of His divine character. We see it time and time again throughout Scripture. God, in His mercy and justice, is committed to restoring what has been lost. This is not simply a matter of returning things to their previous state, but an act of divine healing and transformation that brings renewal and a greater fullness of life. God's restorative work is not passive or incomplete. It is thorough, intentional, and purposeful. When something is taken from us, especially when it's taken unjustly or through hardship, it can feel like an insurmountable loss. But the truth is that God, who sees all and knows all, is not content to let His people suffer in their loss. He is a God who pursues restoration with great care, working on behalf of those who seek Him, and He does so in ways that often surpass our understanding. It is important to understand that God's restoration is not merely about replacing what was lost, nor is it about restoring us to the exact same place we were before the loss occurred. His restoration is always about a deeper work, a work that goes beyond the surface level, reaching deep into our hearts and spirits, transforming us and aligning us with His greater purpose. This is a part of His character that we can cling to in times of sorrow and disappointment. We are assured that He will not leave us in our brokenness, but will take our pain, our wounds, and our unmet expectations and turn them into something far more beautiful than we could ever have imagined. When we look at the Bible, we see example after example of God's restoration. In the Old Testament, God promises to restore the fortunes of Israel after their time of exile, after they had been scattered and displaced, after they had lost their land, their homes, and their identity. The prophets speak of a time when God would gather His people back, bringing them from the east, west, north, and south. Their scattered and broken state would be made whole again, and they would experience prosperity, peace, and favor. This promise was not just about returning to what was, but about bringing Israel into a place of greater blessing and a deeper relationship with God. God's restoration is never about returning to what we once had. It is about a new kind of life that could not have been achieved without the experience of loss. In the New Testament, we see the ultimate act of restoration through Jesus Christ. His death and resurrection made possible the restoration of humanity's relationship with God. Through Him, we are made whole again, restored to the fullness of life that God intended for us from the beginning. Understanding that restitution is part of God's character helps us trust Him in times of loss. When things are taken from us, whether it is our health, a loved one, a dream, or our peace of mind, we are often left feeling like something essential has been lost, something irreplaceable. But we must remember that God does not leave us empty-handed in our loss. He promises that He will restore what was taken, and not only that, but He will give us more than we can imagine. When we allow God to work in our lives, we open ourselves up to the potential for something greater than what we had before. This restoration is not necessarily about material wealth or the exact same situation returning to our lives, but rather about a spiritual and emotional healing that brings us into greater alignment with His will and His purpose. One of the beautiful aspects of God's restoration is that it is not limited by time or human understanding. When we lose something, we often focus on how it makes us feel in the present, the pain and the longing that arise from our loss. And it's only natural to want to be restored immediately, to have the void filled as quickly as possible. But God's restoration works differently. It doesn't follow our timeline, and it doesn't always look like we think it should. Sometimes it takes years for us to see how God has been working in our lives. Sometimes it takes a lifetime for the full impact of His restoration to unfold. This can be difficult to accept, especially in moments of deep grief or frustration. We want answers now. We want healing now. We want to feel whole again, but part of trusting God's restorative power is learning to surrender our own understanding of time and space, trusting that He is doing a work in us that will ultimately lead to something far greater than we could have imagined. There is always a bigger picture at play, and God's view of time is so much broader than our own. Restitution in this sense becomes a process, not an immediate result. And yet this process is one of immense value. We often learn the deepest lessons during our most painful seasons. It is through the loss and the waiting that God is able to refine us, to strengthen us, and to help us become the people we were always meant to be. Without loss, there can be no restoration. Without a broken heart, there can be no healing. That when we allow God to move in the midst of our pain, He takes the shattered pieces of our lives and turns them into something beautiful. His restoration is a deep healing, a renewal of our minds, hearts, and spirits, drawing us closer to Him and transforming us in ways that we could not have imagined before, Amy. God's restorative work also extends to the things we often overlook. We may think that our greatest losses are the most tangible, the things we can touch, see, and feel. But God is in the business of restoring our souls as well. He is concerned with the deep, invisible parts of our lives, the areas where we've been hurt by others, where we've been wounded by our own choices, and where we've lost faith. These are the places where God's restorative power shines the brightest. Through His love and grace, He heals our broken hearts, restores our sense of purpose, and brings us to a place of peace that transcends our understanding. He is in the business of mending not just what is visible, but also what is hidden in the depths of our hearts. Ultimately, the nature of God's restoration is one of fullness. It is a promise that what was lost will be returned, but in a way that is richer, deeper, and more satisfying than we ever thought possible. It is not just about returning to the way things were. It is about moving forward, stronger and more complete, into a future where God's will is at the center of our lives. The pain, the loss, and the struggle become part of the journey, but they do not define us. In the end, what defines us is God's grace and His ability to restore, to heal, and to bring us into a place of greater wholeness than we ever imagined. So when you find yourself facing loss or brokenness, remember that God is a restorer, and He will not leave you empty. His work in your life is not about getting back what was taken, but about bringing you to a place of greater strength, greater joy, and greater intimacy with Him. Trust in His restorative power, for it is a promise that He will always keep. In life, there are times when we find ourselves in the midst of uncertainty, when things are difficult and it feels like there is no way forward. It is in these moments that our faith can often be shaken, and we may begin to question whether God is still at work in our lives. The second sign that God will restore what was taken from you is trust in the unseen. Even when we cannot see it, even when the situation seems hopeless, God is working behind the scenes. His work is not always visible to us in the moment, and sometimes it takes time for us to see the full picture. However, this is where trust becomes paramount. Trust is the belief that, even in the darkness, God is still working, preparing the way for our restoration, even when we cannot perceive it. It is natural for us as humans to want immediate results, to want to see things changing right before our eyes. We want solutions, answers, and restoration in our own time and on our own terms. However, God's ways and timing often transcend our limited understanding. Just as a seed is planted in the soil and begins to grow unseen before it breaks through the surface, so too is God's work often done in the hidden places of our hearts and lives. We may not always see how He is moving, but that does not mean He is not at work. It is in these times of uncertainty, when we feel like we are wandering without clear direction, that we must place our trust in the fact that God has a plan for us. The absence of visible progress does not equal absence of divine action. Trusting in the unseen also requires us to step back and relinquish control. As human beings, we often want to take charge of the situation, to force things to happen in the way we think they should. But restoration, true restoration, is not something we can manufacture on our own. It is a process that requires patience, surrender, and faith. We must learn to trust that God knows what is best for us, even if it doesn't align with our own expectations or desires. The unseen work of God is always aligned with His greater purpose, and we must trust that He is leading us exactly where we need to go. Experience, observation, is the quickest and safest method of guidance. This trust in the unseen also demands a perspective shift. These seasons are not without purpose. They are moments in which God is shaping us, teaching us to rely on Him, and preparing us for what is to come. We may not know how, and we may not understand why, but we can trust that God's unseen work is leading us to a place of restoration and renewal. Moreover, trusting in the unseen involves leaning into God's promises. Throughout Scripture, we are reminded that God is faithful, that He is with us even in our struggles, and that He will not abandon us. When we face trials, it is easy to forget these promises, to lose sight of the fact that God is still at work. However, the call is to hold on to His word, to trust that what He has said will come to pass. God's promises are not bound by our circumstances, and even when the evidence of restoration is not immediately visible, we can trust that His promises are true. When we place our faith in what is unseen, we are choosing to trust in God's character and in His commitment to bring about restoration in our lives. In the moments when we are unsure of how things will turn out, when the path ahead seems unclear, we must learn to rest in God's unseen work. It is in these times of waiting and uncertainty that our faith is tested and refined. Trusting God's ability to restore what was taken from us requires an unwavering belief that He is always at work behind the scenes, even when we cannot see the full picture. In the quiet, hidden places of our lives, God is preparing something greater than we could ever imagine. The key is to trust in His timing, His plan, and His ability to bring about restoration in ways that transcend our understanding. Even when we cannot see the end, we can trust in the One who knows the beginning, the middle, and the end, and we can rest assured that He is working for our good. Loss is one of the most difficult experiences we encounter in life. Whether it is the loss of a relationship, a dream, a sense of security, or an opportunity, It leaves us with a feeling of emptiness and confusion. We may ask ourselves why something so precious was taken from us, and in moments of grief, we may struggle to see any meaning in the hardship. But the third sign that God will restore what was taken from you is that he often uses loss as preparation for something greater. It is through loss that God refines us, shapes us, and prepares us for the fullness of what he has in store. Loss is not just a random event. It is a part of God's greater plan for our lives, a process that leads to restoration and transformation. God's ways are not always immediately clear to us, especially when we are in the midst of a trial. We often cannot see the bigger picture, and in our pain we might wonder why things had to unfold the way they did. We may think of our losses as setbacks, as if we are being punished or forsaken. But God does not waste our pain. Every loss we experience is an opportunity for us to grow, to learn, and to depend more deeply on him. In fact, loss is often the most powerful tool God uses to prepare us for the restoration he is bringing into our lives. It is during our times of difficulty that we are molded and shaped into the people he desires us to be. The process of preparation through loss may not be easy or comfortable, but it is a necessary part of our journey. Through loss, we are forced to confront our weaknesses, our fears, and our vulnerabilities. It strips away the things that we may have relied on for comfort or security, and it exposes areas of our lives that need healing or transformation. It may prove fatal to our health. So we may, from this loss, be brought back to life. In these moments, we can either choose to close ourselves off to God, holding on to the pain and bitterness, or we can open our hearts to his work in us, allowing him to refine us through the fire. The refining process is painful, but it is always purposeful. It is through the fire that gold is purified, and it is through our losses that God prepares us for the greater things he has in store. One of the most significant ways that God prepares us through loss is by teaching us to rely on him. When we lose something, we are often left with a sense of helplessness, a feeling that we have no control over the situation. This can be unsettling, especially for those of us who are used to being self-sufficient or in control. But this is where God meets us. In our weakness, his strength is made perfect. It is through loss that we are reminded of our dependence on him. We come to realize that we cannot control everything in life, that we are not the ones who hold the world together. It is only through God's power, grace, and provision that we can find peace, healing, and restoration. Loss pushes us to surrender our illusions of control and to trust in the one who holds our lives in his hands. Loss also has the power to refine our character. It is easy to be kind, patient, and loving when things are going well, but it is in times of hardship that our true character is revealed. When we face difficulty, our reactions to the situation often expose the areas in our hearts that still need work. In times of loss, we may feel angry, resentful, or fearful. These emotions are normal, but they also provide an opportunity for growth. God uses these feelings to bring us face to face with our own shortcomings, allowing us to address the areas in our hearts that need healing. He does not leave us in these painful emotions, but he guides us through them, teaching us how to respond with grace, forgiveness, and love. As we allow God to work on our hearts, we are transformed into people who reflect his character more fully. Loss, in this sense, becomes a tool for sanctification, helping us to become more like Christ in our attitude and actions. End of text. Another way that God prepares us through loss is by deepening our faith. When everything is going well, it is easy to feel self-sufficient, to take credit for the good things in our lives, and to forget our need for God. But in times of loss, we are reminded of our utter dependence on Him. Our faith is stretched and tested, and we are given the opportunity to learn what it truly means to trust in God's promises. It is during these seasons that we learn to lean on His Word, to cling to His truth, and to believe that He will restore what was taken. Our faith grows stronger as we hold on to the hope that God is still at work, even in the midst of our suffering. We learn that our faith is not based on our circumstances, but on the unshakable foundation of God's love, power, and faithfulness. Through loss, we are also taught to embrace humility. We may have had high expectations for our lives, believing that we had everything figured out or that we deserved certain things. This humility prepares us to receive the restoration that God has for us. It opens our hearts to the truth that God's blessings are not something we can earn or deserve, but something He gives freely according to His grace. When we let go of our pride and self-sufficiency, we position ourselves to receive the fullness of God's restoration, which is always better than anything we could have imagined on our own. Loss also teaches us to value what truly matters. When we experience hardship, we often reassess our priorities. The things that once seemed important may lose their significance, and we begin to focus on the things that truly bring meaning and purpose to our lives. In the face of loss, we are reminded that the temporary things of this world, wealth, success, status, are not the things that give us lasting fulfillment. Wealth, success, status are not the things that give us lasting fulfillment. It's the relationships we have, our faith in God, and the love we share with others that bring true joy and peace. Loss shifts our perspective, helping us to see what is truly valuable and to realign our hearts with God's priorities. This shift in perspective prepares us to fully appreciate the restoration that God brings. As we understand the true restoration that God brings, as we understand that true restoration is not about material things, but about deeper, more meaningful aspects of life. Ultimately, the process of preparation through loss is not about the loss itself, but about what God does in us and through us in the midst of it. Loss is painful, yes, but it is not pointless. It is through loss that we are refined, shaped, and prepared for something greater. God does not waste our pain. He uses it to create in us a greater capacity for His love, a deeper faith, and a more humble heart. When we experience loss, we can trust that God is not only preparing us for restoration, but also for a deeper relationship with Him. Through loss, we are made ready to receive what God has promised. And when the time comes, we will find that His restoration is more than we could have imagined. Patience is one of the hardest virtues to cultivate, especially in a world that thrives on immediacy and instant gratification. When something important is taken from us, the natural response is often the desire to see things restored quickly. We may want our pain to end immediately, our brokenness to be healed without delay, and the things we've lost to be returned as soon as possible. However, the fourth sign that God will restore what was taken from you is the patience we must learn to embrace while waiting for restoration. Restoration often doesn't happen overnight, and it is in this waiting period that our faith is tested and refined. Patience is not just about enduring the wait, but learning to trust God in the process, knowing that His timing is always perfect, even when it doesn't align with our own. It is easy to be impatient when we are in a season of loss or difficulty. The uncertainty of waiting can be frustrating, and we may begin to wonder why God hasn't acted yet. We may feel abandoned, as if God has forgotten us or is not paying attention to our cries. However, It is important to remember that God's perspective is far greater than ours. He sees the bigger picture, and His timing is always aligned with what is best for us. Our impatience often stems from our limited understanding of God's plan. We may only see our current circumstances, the pain we are experiencing, and the things that are missing from our lives. But God, in His infinite wisdom, is working behind the scenes, preparing us for the restoration He has promised. While we wait, He is shaping us, molding us, and building our character in ways that we cannot fully appreciate in the moment. Patience teaches us to trust that God is working, even when we cannot see it. There are times when we feel as though nothing is changing, that our situation will never improve, and that restoration is far off. In these moments, we must remind ourselves that God is still at work, even when we cannot perceive it. Just as a seed is planted in the ground and begins to grow unseen, so too is God's work happening in our lives, even when it feels like we are standing still. God's restoration is not bound by our timelines. His work in us is deeper than just fixing external circumstances. It is about transforming our hearts, renewing our minds, and preparing us for the future He has in store. This process takes time, and it requires patience. Another aspect of patience in the waiting process is the surrender of control. It is often difficult for us to wait because we want to take matters into our own hands. We may think that if we work harder, make different decisions, or push the situation forward ourselves, we can speed up the process. But true restoration comes when we surrender our desire for control and trust in God's ability to handle our circumstances. Patience teaches us that we are not the ones in charge, God is. We must learn to let go of our need to manipulate outcomes and instead trust that God is doing the work in His time and in His way. Surrendering control requires humility and trust, acknowledging that God knows what is best for us and that His timing is always better than our own. Patience also helps us grow in endurance. When we are in a season of waiting, we may feel weak, as though we cannot bear any more hardship. But patience builds resilience. It teaches us to endure difficult circumstances with grace and perseverance. Through patience, we learn that we are not defined by our struggles, but by how we respond to them. As we wait for God's restoration, we are strengthened and our faith is deepened. We begin to see that our endurance through hardship is part of the restoration process. The challenges we face are not meant to break us, but to refine us. God uses our struggles to strengthen our faith and to build in us a character that can endure, that can stand firm, even in the face of difficulty. Patience also teaches us to focus on God's promises rather than our present circumstances. In times of loss, it can be easy to become fixated on what we've lost, on the pain we're feeling, and on the emptiness that lingers. However, patience redirects our focus. It calls us to look beyond our current situation and to set our eyes on the hope that God will restore what was taken. In the waiting, we are reminded of God's faithfulness. He has made promises to us, and He will keep them. Patience allows us to trust in God's word, to cling to the hope that He will bring about the restoration He has promised, even if we do not yet see the full picture. It shifts our perspective from the present moment to the future glory that God is preparing for us. While we wait, it is essential to remember that our patience is not passive. Waiting does not mean doing nothing. God calls us to continue moving forward in faith, to keep seeking Him, to keep trusting Him, and to keep walking the path He has set before us. Patience is an active waiting, a waiting that involves prayer, worship, and obedience. It is during the waiting that we are called to continue to grow, to continue to seek God's will and to continue to trust that He is leading us toward restoration. Waiting does not mean sitting idly by. It means faithfully continuing on the journey, knowing that God is at work, even when we cannot see the results.